Check that you have all of your patterns. Front, back, placket, collar stand, collar, back hem, front hem, sleeve, sleeve cuff. Sew up the darts on the front panels. I'm using a sample piece for better demonstration. Mark out the center front and placket notch on the front panel. Decide which would be the upper and lower placket. I'll be using the denim for the upper placket. On the wrong side of the upper placket, transfer the marking from the paper pattern. Then measure and mark 1.5 cm from the bottom. Place the edge of the upper placket along the center front and align the marking to the placket notch. On the wrong side of the lower placket, transfer the marking from the paper pattern. Put the edge of the lower placket along the center front and align the top to the neckline. Sew along the markings in a rectangular shape. Draw a triangle shape with a height of 1.5 cm towards the center front. Grab a pair of scissors and snip down the center front and diagonal markings. Flip the plackets through the opening. On the right side, check that the corners are laying flat and that the fabric is not pulling. From the wrong side, push all the seam allowances towards the center front and iron well. Fold the placket so that it covers the opening completely and iron well. Do not fold too little or too much. On the right side, sew in the ditch in the seam where the front and placket meets, making sure to catch onto the fabric below. You have two options. Your first option is to leave the overlock edge visible. This makes it much easier. The other option is to fold in the overlock edge so that it's not visible. For this step, you need to fold just enough to cover the stitches below. When sewing in the ditch, your stitch will fall very close at the fold edge, making this the more challenging option. Flip up the front panel to expose the triangular piece. Sew a straight line along the base, making sure to catch all layers of fabric. Once you're done, on the right side, check that the corners are laying flat. Using the tip of the triangle as a guide, snip away the excess and overlock the layers together. Smoothen out the neckline by snipping away the excess placket. On the front and back hem panels, fold up the hem by 1 cm and iron well. Then top stitch 0.8 cm from the folded edge. On the right side of the front panel, transfer the markings from the paper pattern. Double fold inwards following the markings and iron well. Then top stitch 2 cm from the folded edge, making sure to catch onto the fabric below. Sew the back and back hem panels together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Mark out the fold line, then fold the fabric along the marking and iron well. Mark out the sewing line and sew along the line, making sure to catch onto the seam allowances below. Repeat for the front. Sew the front and front hem panels together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Fold along the fold line, iron well, and sew along the sewing line. With the front and back panels together, sew along the shoulders and on the wearer's right side seam with a 1 cm seam allowance. On the wearer's left, mark out the zip notch. Sew the zipper starting from the zip notch with a 1 cm seam allowance. Finish sewing up the rest of the side seam with a 1 cm seam allowance. On the sleeve panels, mark out the notches according to the paper pattern. Sew 2 rows of gathering stitches along the sleeve crown. Fold the sleeve into half and sew along the side seam with a 1 cm seam allowance. Sew a pair of sleeve cuff panels together along the bottom with a 1 cm seam allowance. Grab a pair of scissors and snip into the seam allowances to reduce the tension and bulk. Flip open and on the wrong side, push all the seam allowances towards the panel with the interfacing and iron well. On the right side, understitch on the panel with interfacing, making sure to catch onto the seam allowances below. Fold the sleeve cuff into half and sew along the short edge with a 1 cm seam allowance. Flip so all right sides are facing out and iron well. Baste both layers together with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. With the seams aligned, sew the sleeve to the sleeve cuff with a 1 cm seam allowance. Overlock the edge. Attach the sleeve to the armhole with a 1 cm seam allowance, focusing most of the gathers near the shoulder seam. Repeat on the other side. Sew the collar panels together along the bottom with a 1 cm seam allowance. Grab a pair of scissors and snip and trim into the seam allowances to reduce the bulk and tension. Turn it inside out and iron well. Mark out the notches on the collar stand panels. Sew the collar stand to the collar, making sure to match up the notches. Sew them together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Fold and sew down the inner collar stand, the one with no interfacing, at the ends by 0.8 cm. Grab a pair of scissors and snip into the seam allowances to reduce the tension and bulk. Turn it inside out and iron well. Mark out the shoulder notches on the collar stand. Sew the outer collar stand, the one with interfacing, to the neckline with a 1 cm seam allowance. Making sure to match up the shoulder seams and pushing away the inner collar stand. Grab a pair of scissors and snip into the seam allowances to reduce tension. Push up all the seam allowances and iron well. Fold down the inner collar stand, then tuck in the raw edge so that it covers the stitching below. Repeat this along the whole neckline. Iron well. On the right side, sew in the ditch where the collar stand meets the neckline, making sure to catch onto the folded edge of the collar stand below. Add buttons if you wish. And there you have it, your dress is completed.